everybody. How's the volume? Is this mic picking me up okay? In the back, give me thumbs up if you can hear me. All right, give me thumbs down if you cannot hear me. I'm getting some non-responders, that's okay. All right. If you need any adjustments, please interrupt me. Well, thanks everybody for being here. I am really excited to be here along with my dear friend and colleague, Kathleen Strickland-Cohen, to talk to you. We're lucky that we're good friends and we also get to work together. It's a lot of fun. But I'm really excited to be here to talk to you about a topic that's near and dear to both Kathleen and I, which is thinking about behavioral function across all tiers within a multi-tiered system of support, continuum, not just at Tier 3. Before we get started, I just want to offer some acknowledgments. The work that we're going to be presenting today is going to be included in a paper that's in preparation, and so we want to acknowledge some of our co-authors, Dr. Kelsey Morris and Dylan Zimmerman. Both of them have been really helpful in progressing our thinking around this topic, and they also helped us present on this topic at the Association for Positive Behavior Support Conference just this past winter. Some objectives. So if Kathleen and I do our job today, we're hoping that you're going to walk away learning 4 different things or being able to talk more deeply about 4 different things. The first is to be able to describe and define behavioral function. Now I know that that's likely going to be a review for some of you, but we're going to provide just some very fundamental information about behavioral function to make sure that we're all on the same page as we move forward in talking more deeply about the content. We'd also like you to be able to describe the utility of and the rationale for why we might want to consider function across all tiers of support, not just at Tier 3. So we're talking primarily at Tiers 1 and 2. We're also hoping that you'll be able to then provide some examples of contextually appropriate function-matched interventions across all the tiers, and to be able to identify what we mean by functional skills that all students need to learn. We're going to start by going through some terms. I'm going to briefly talk about function and behavior, as I mentioned. We'll then move into talking about function-based thinking and what in the world we mean by function-based thinking, those functional skills. Kathleen is then going to take over and talk about function at Tier 3 and Tier 2. I'll then take the mic back and talk about function at Tier 1, and we're hoping to leave about 15 minutes for questions. All right, kind of back up here before we get started. When we're thinking about student behavior, we are operating under some assumptions. We need to remember that student behavior is learned. The behavior that the student is engaging in is something that they have learned to do because it's a way of getting their needs met. It's something that is adaptive to them to get their needs met in that particular situation. And we also need to respect and remember that the need the student has at that time is valid for them. So although it might be really frustrating when they're wanting the teacher's attention during a time when they really should be doing independent work, that is still a valid need for them, and that's not something that we're going to change. What we can change is teaching them socially appropriate skills to get their needs met. But the need is still valid for them, and we need to respect and acknowledge that. Student behavior also happens for a reason, so it's not something that happens randomly, although it might feel like it happens randomly. If we really look at the environmental events that happen before a behavior occurs and after a behavior occurs, we can start thinking about, well, why exactly is this behavior occurring, which is the function. I already touched on it a little bit, but behavior is communication. It's often a way that the student is trying to communicate to us that, hey, something's not cool here. Hey, I need something right now. And it's a way that they're communicating that because they might not have the skills to do so otherwise. So that gets to the last point there, that it could be a result of skill deficits. I forgot to mention too, both Kathleen and I are absolutely comfortable being interrupted. So if I say something that doesn't jive or you have a question about it, raise your hand. If I don't see your hand, shout out, hey Sarah, over here. Like, we're totally fine with that. So please, we prefer this to be, an opportunity for you to ask questions throughout if you would like to do that. All right, so let's hop into behavioral function and what we mean by function. We're going to be talking about function in 3 ways. So the function of behavior, which is what y'all probably think about when we say function. We're going to be talking about function-based thinking and, again, those functional skills. So I'm going to talk briefly about all 3 of these, and then we're going to pass it over to Kathleen, and she'll start talking about Tier 3. Function of behavior, so this is the why the student is engaging in the behavior. It's the reason behind the behavior, why it keeps happening. And the reason that it keeps happening is because some type of reinforcement is happening following that behavior. This could be positive reinforcement, where some type of preferred activity, a preferred person, something exciting to the student's environment is added. So it's something that they like that's added to the environment. Or it could be negative reinforcement, where something is removed from the environment. So it could be that they're able to escape a particular task that they're not enjoying too much. It could be that there's an activity that is just something they do not enjoy, and that activity is then removed. It could be removal of social interaction or any sensory stimulation. So if the lights are too bright, and I say that with those lights right there, that might be a sensory experience that some people might have a problem with, and you might engage in behavior to then remove that sensory stimulation from your environment. So a lot of this might be a review, but any questions before I move forward? Okay. So we hypothesize the function of a particular behavior by observing patterns in the environmental events that happen before and following the occurrence of the behavior. So I'm going to use my cursor because I don't think this is, oh, it does work, okay. So we have the behavior. I'm going to use this because there's two of them. So we have the behavior that's situated right here, right? So that's what the student is doing at that time. Then we're going to look at some of the environmental events that happen before the behavior occurs, which is right in here, those setting events and antecedents. Setting events are things that happen kind of further out in the student's life. Further out meaning like maybe the night before, or maybe the morning of coming to school, or maybe even the instructional period before the instructional block that they're moving to. Something happened in that time period that's going to potentially put them in a situation where problem behavior is going to be more likely. And we're going to go through a couple examples too, so that might become a little more solidified then. We then have the antecedents, which are the things that happen immediately before the behavior happens. Some people like to use the word triggers, or this is the trigger to the behavior. So something happens and the behavior immediately follows. We then have the behavior, of course, and then we have the consequences, or what happens after the behavior. And the consequences is where we see that reinforcement happening. So we're really looking at the consequence end to be thinking about, well, why does this behavior keep occurring? So if we look at these environmental events and the patterns that we might see by taking all of this information into consideration, we can then hypothesize a function. So let's go through an example. A lot of times we talk about function with individual students, so we're going to go through the example as an individual student, and then we're going to go through an example where we're thinking about groups of students, which might be a little bit different. So let's say we have a student that in the morning they didn't have breakfast. I don't know about y'all, but if I don't have breakfast, that is going to set me on a course to have not so great of a day because I'm going to be hungry until lunchtime. So let's say we have a student where that could be a similar setting event for them, where they didn't have breakfast. They're then given an instruction in their first period class. The student then rips up the paper. As a result of ripping up the paper, the teacher might send that student to the office. And so if we see this happening over and we see a pattern of these type of events happening and surrounding the behavior, we could then hypothesize that the student is likely ripping the paper or engaging in that property destruction to get out of that instructional task. So we would say avoid or escape instruction. So I know that's a super clean, crisp example, but that's, kind of fundamental understanding of function as we move forward in talking about the content today. Now let's think about it with groups, because function we often think about with individual students. What Kathleen and I hope to communicate today is you can also think about it with groups of students. So let's say we have a group of students where it was one of those lovely Michigan winters in February where it was freezing cold and we had indoor recess. So students usually would go outdoors for recess, but they had to stay indoors, which could potentially function as a setting event. We're like, oh, they're going to be a little squirrely this afternoon, potentially. Let's say the students are then given an instruction, so large group instruction, teachers starting a didactic math lesson, for example. Students aren't really engaging in the lesson, they're instead hanging out and talking with one another. And then as a result of that, they continue talking and they talk louder and they're reinforcing each other's talking behavior. And soon, y'all have been in classrooms before where the level starts at like a 1 and then at 5 minutes in, it just escalates in intensity because they're amping each other up. They're talking, yeah. So we could see this happening with the group. where they're reinforcing each other's behavior and the talking is getting louder and more out of control, if we're seeing this pattern happen over, and we're seeing those similar environmental events and consequence events happening, we could then hypothesize that for our group of students here, they're likely talking to each other to, no surprise, gain peer attention. They're doing this, they're really not interested in the lesson, and this could be in part a result because they had indoor recess, and so they might not have had the opportunity to hang out with their friends and engage in activities that they usually would with their friends, and so they're in a state of like deprivation, we call it for technical terms. So I wanted to go through those two examples just to offer a point of thinking about function for the individual student, which we often do at Tier 3, but we really can be thinking about function for groups of students at the class-wide or small group level too. All right, let's move into function-based thinking. So this is a word Kathleen and I are going to use today too, and really what we mean about function-based thinking is a call to think about function and consider function when designing behavior support across all tiers. So with our Tier 1 and with our Tier 2 and of course at Tier 3. Thinking about function, this could include conducting an FBA or functional behavior assessment, but not always. Kathleen will give a nice overview of FBA and a little refresher for folks. But what we're thinking about with function-based thinking is that you're identifying patterns and typical routines that are happening throughout the school day to hypothesize a function. So we're thinking, well, what are the setting events that happen? What are the antecedents? What are the behaviors? What are the consequences? And just putting on your thinking cap, thinking functionally without necessarily having to do a full-blown FBA. Because doing an FBA, as we know in schools, is quite resource intensive, and it's not something we're going to be able to do at Tier 1 for all the kids. But we can think about function and try to hypothesize what might be going on. All right, turning to functional skills then. So this is the last term related to function that I want to talk through because it's a term I'm going to be talking about particularly at Tier 1. Functional skills are skills that anybody needs to be successful in life. Anybody, me, Kathleen, y'all, our students. These are things like asking for things that you need, saying you need a break when you need a break. We have those personal liberties, so any of y'all could get up right now and go take a break if you needed to, right? Because you have the skills and the repertoire to know how to do that in a socially appropriate manner given this context. Not all of our students do when they walk into our door. So at Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3, we really should be thinking about those functional skills. And if we have a student who's walking into our door and they don't have those, let's not wait for problem or interfering behavior to develop. Why don't we just teach it right away? And I'll talk more about that at the Tier 1 level. This also directly maps on to the goals of positive behavior support that was put forth by Carr et al. In 2002, which is we're teaching skills to improve a person's quality of life. We're teaching skills, and when we do that, when we teach those skills, then we're going to see a reduction in some of that behavior that interferes with learning. But our first goal should be teaching skills. All right, one more slide, and then you'll get a break and get to go to Kathleen here. So we should really, if it's not clear, I'm going to just make it super explicit for y'all, we should really be considering function across all those tiers of support because the behavior that interferes with learning can occur at all of the tiers, although it might not be as severe and chronic at Tiers 1 and Tier 2. But has anybody ever seen a Tier 1 setting where you didn't see any of that interfering behavior? Raise your hand if you have, because I want to come visit your school. Yeah, no, we see it happening at that level. And so if we're seeing it happen at that level, there's no reason that we can't just reflect and think about function as a way to enhance our Tier 1 and Tier 2 supports, which gets to the second point there, is when we're thinking about function, we can really increase the efficacy of Tier 1 and Tier 2. And Kathleen and I will dive into that a little bit further. And then lastly, all students need to learn those functional skills. So all the skills that anybody needs to be successful, those are things that it's our responsibility to teach. So let's think about function. All right. Kathleen. This has not been working super reliably, so I'll let you choose.
Okay, and this is a Mac, so I just, this to...
Yes.
Okay. I'm a PC user. Hi, I'm Kathleen. Thank you all for being here today. We're excited to have the opportunity to talk about this. I'm going to start with talking about behavioral function at Tier 3, which is where you're probably most familiar with hearing this type of language and also thinking about the function of student behavior. So for students who are engaging in challenging behavior that is persistent, is interfering with learning, and has not been or cannot be sufficiently addressed with Tier 2 supports, of course, we're going to think about individualized supports at Tier 3. So at Tier 3, if we're thinking about function-based support, we conduct an FBA. So raise your hand if you're familiar with what an FBA is. So everybody, right? So that's good. So we don't have to go too far in depth in there. So you know that when we're talking about FBA, we're talking about the process through which we gather information from a number of different sources, including the student and those that know them best, to identify what is the challenging behavior or what is the interfering behavior that we're most concerned about, also under what context it occurs, and then also what typically or predictably follows that behavior, like Sarah was showing us earlier. We also want to make sure whenever possible that we're not just doing interviews, but we're also directly observing the behavior in context. Sometimes we get a different lens or perspective when we're actually viewing the behavior in context that we don't get from those interviews that we do. So we use the FBA data to, of course, identify the function of the challenging behavior, right? That's the goal of doing that. But we also want to identify the conditions under which the challenging behavior does not occur. That gives us a really clear picture of under what conditions is this behavior occurring, and that helps us to understand why it may be continuing to occur. Also, when we understand the context in which behavior is not occurring, we can start to see, are there aspects of this particular context that are different from these other contexts, and can we infuse the problematic context with some of those variables or some of those aspects. And then it also helps us to understand what could be functional or desired reinforcers for the behavior that we're looking for or we want to see more of. I'm sorry, I'm like really distracted by those lights. I'm glad that they're there, but I'm just not used to that, so I will adjust. So some of that sensory stimulation you were talking about a moment ago, it's a little bit like, whoa. Okay, so again, looking at when the behavior is not likely to occur can help us to identify some of those functional reinforcers. For example, if a student is not likely to engage in challenging behavior during unstructured social time, that could give us a sense of, okay, they actually like to interact with peers. That's a good thing to know, right? Maybe they are really interested in art, and so that's not a context in which they're likely to engage in challenging behavior. Can we use drawing or use some other type of artistic activity to think about maybe providing that as a reinforcer for behaviors that we want to see more of? So we use, of course, FBA data to then build a behavior support plan or a behavior intervention plan. You may hear me say BSP as kind of interchangeable with BIP. So the result of FBA should be, of course, not just checking a box and saying, yes, we did this, but instead building this kind of function-based behavior support plan where we address prevention, teaching new skills, and then also reinforcing the new skills that we're teaching. So at the prevention level, we want to eliminate or neutralize any of those setting events that Sarah talked about. We want to eliminate or modify antecedent triggers. We also want to make sure that we are setting up the environment so that we're essentially occasioning the behaviors that we want to see more of. So lots of prompts in the environment. If we're teaching new skills, which is next, we want to make sure that we're not just teaching those skills, but we're actually setting up situations in which the student can practice those new skills and, of course, receive reinforcement for those new skills, right? So at the teaching level, we're trying to teach those behaviors that will replace, hopefully, or at least act as an alternative to the challenging or interfering behavior. So like Sarah mentioned, behavior is communication. Right, I'm communicating something through this behavior that I'm engaging in. So we want to make sure that I'm giving you another way to express that same need. We also want to make sure that we're teaching new skills along with that. So for those of you that are familiar with implementing BIPs, for example, of course, initially we want that replacement skill, right? That's sort of our temporary fix, if you will, or our Band-Aid so that we can get that challenging behavior to come down quickly. And then what we want to be doing, of course, at the same time is teaching the skills that the student needs in order to access more what we think of as natural reinforcers in the environment. So I want to give you, for example, Sarah gave that example about maybe escaping academic tasks. So of course I want to teach you maybe how to ask appropriately for a break, but that's not all I'm going to do, right? I'm also going to teach you the skills that you need to be accessing reinforcement for being engaged in academic tasks so that hopefully we can really see a decrease in the use of that replacement skill, and instead you're accessing those natural reinforcers in the environment. So of course, those natural reinforcements are the last piece here. We want to make sure that there is a dense schedule of reinforcement in place for those new skills and behaviors that we're teaching. And we also, to the extent that possible, we want to minimize reinforcement for challenging behavior. And I say minimize instead of eliminate altogether because I think that I speak for all of us when I say that I can't make anybody do anything. So there are times that we have to really rely on that dense schedule of reinforcement for other behaviors as opposed to just minimizing reinforcement for challenging behavior. Because sometimes we don't have all of the cards in our hand and we can't make that possible. So what the research tells us about FBA in schools, and again, Sarah, if I end up talking too much, like just get a big hook and like pull me off the stage so that you have time to finish. Yeah. So for students who require Tier 3 support, function-based intervention is of course key to preventing and decreasing intense and persistent challenging behavior. But what we also know is there's a growing body of research showing that function-based interventions have been shown to improve effectiveness and efficiency of behavior support for students with and without disabilities who engage in a wide range of challenging behaviors. So this is a little bit different way to think about perhaps using function-based support at Tier 3. We tend to think about Tier 3 being specifically for students who have IEPs. And sometimes we even get confused and think Tier 3 means special education, but we know that's not the case, right? So this growing body of research shows that Tier 3 can be effectively designed and implemented also by school-based personnel, particularly around addressing what we think of as non-dangerous challenging behavior. But we see, as we often see, this sort of research to practice gap, right? So we know one thing is possible, but what we actually see playing out in schools can sometimes be different. So in typical practice, we often use our most effective tools, in that case being also our function-based tools, only when challenging behavior has become severe. So it's only when it's become severe or dangerous that we think about FBA as sort of a last resort. And in part because of what you said earlier, Sarah, which is that it is resource intensive, and we understand that. But students who engage in persistent lower level challenges, unfortunately, are more likely to receive less effective punitive kinds of consequences. So things like reprimands, office discipline referrals, suspensions, and expulsions, which we all know don't work. So the logic behind PBIS, or multi-tiered systems of support, as you all know, is that we are going to create these social climates that support student behavior with a focus on prevention and early intervention. So when I say early intervention, I'm not just talking about itty-bitties. I'm also talking about intervening early, when challenging behavior first starts to sort of rear its ugly head, if you will. So as soon as we see that our Tier 2 supports, for example, aren't working, rather than leaving students in what I think of as like the Tier 2 vortex, in which we sort of continue to throw Tier 2 interventions at them until behavior finally gets bad enough that we're starting to talk about things like change of placement or referrals for special education. You know, we want to think about our function-based tools before we get there to hopefully sort of turn some of that behavior around and move back down the tiers instead of continuing up. Oh.
There was a question online. They wanted to know if you could speak a little bit more about what you meant by a dense schedule of reinforcement.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good A good question, thank you, and I'm sorry if I was speaking behaviorese in that sense. So it just means we want to provide lots of reinforcement. So one of the things that we can think about is, if a challenging behavior has been occurring for a while and it's received a lot of reinforcement, like think about not only sort of your need to match that schedule of reinforcement is one way to think about it. So matching the amount of reinforcement that the student has already been receiving, but for a different behavior. We may even want to surpass that, right? So if I'm already receiving a certain amount of reinforcement for engaging in problem behavior, I've got to flip that script for my student. I've got to flip that script and make sure that now, again, that sort of minimizing that reinforcement for what they've already been doing and maximizing reinforcement for the new behavior that I'm teaching. Because if I've taught that behavior, but the student isn't contacting reinforcement for that new skill that I've just taught, then they're likely to just rely on the old behavior that has been working already. I don't know who asked the question, but hopefully that's helpful. Okay. Okay. So coming back to this idea of using Tier 3 support or using function-based support more proactively at Tier 3. So many of the problem behaviors that Tier 3 teams encounter don't require what we think of as comprehensive FBA and BIP. So not necessarily like with your wraparound supports and safety plans in place and all that jazz, right? So some behavior we can actually address with a function-based approach, but using more streamlined processes. So we're always going to have students within our school that do require complex FBA and maybe even functional assessment at functional analysis at times. So, when we're thinking about challenging behaviors that are persistent, that occur across all environments, for example, also when we think about students that have very limited communicative repertoires. So if I have very few ways to communicate my needs, I'm more likely to engage in challenging behavior to meet a number of different needs because that's what I've learned to do. But for our students that are engaging, for example, in interfering behavior during really specific times of the day, where we can nail down under these conditions is when this is most likely to happen, that gives us a much clearer picture of why the behavior might be occurring. So in those cases, we can sometimes address that through more streamlined processes, where we're still thinking about prevention, teaching, and consequence-based strategies, but again, in a more streamlined way. And one of the ways that we can do this, and I'm not going to go too far into this because I know that's a whole other talk, but one of the ways that we can do this is by thinking really efficiently about how we're using our resources and ensuring that we're building capacity within schools so that there are folks within each campus who can do some of these more basic kinds of FBAs and BIPs. So again, I don't have time to go into that in depth, but I do want to give you a resource to go to. So if you want to learn more about this, go to, actually you can go to all of the new Tier 3 briefs and guides that we have on pbis.org. Where we're addressing a lot of this, but we particularly have this brief that's focused specifically on brief functional behavioral assessment and behavior support planning. So I recommend that you go to pbis.org and take a look at that if it's something you're interested in knowing more about. But for now, for the sake of time, I'm going to sort of jump back to this idea of ensuring that we build within our PBIS or MTSS systems, that we're building this seamless continuum of support. So one of the reasons I like this triangle or this picture of triangles really particularly is I love the way that you can see that green layer goes all the way up, right? So even if our students are receiving support at Tier 3 or when they're receiving Tier 2 supports, they are still getting all of our supports at Tier 1. And they should still be very much included in all of the supports that are being thought of as school-wide supports. So even, and this gets a little tricky, but even our students that are in separated settings, they still need to be getting Tier 1 supports. And those staff that support those students still need to understand what we mean by school-wide supports and what we're doing across the school. Because, of course, when we're thinking about Tier 2 or even Tier 3 interventions, and Tier 3 in particular, we're not talking about interventions that we want in place in perpetuity, right? If I'm giving you the most intensive support that you can get, the goal, of course, is that you're improving. And that hopefully as you're improving or your behavior is changing, you're growing in independence and you're going to be able to move back down the tiers. That would be our goal. So when we think about this sort of tiered system like this and making sure that it's all seamlessly linked, it helps, one, to ensure that our students with Tier 3 needs are included in all settings within the school. Also, when we're thinking about generalization of skills, again, if I've done really great work at Tier 3 and maybe I'm in a separate setting, unfortunately, then if I'm included in other settings, if there isn't that sort of continuity between those settings, you're not going to get that generalization that you're looking for in the other settings, and the ability to fade. So one thing that we don't talk enough about at Tiers 2 or 3 is how to systematically fade those supports back. Not removing because they're doing better, so let's rip it away, right? But no, how do we systematically fade those supports and ensure that we have those particular conditions in place in the new settings that are going to help that behavior to generalize? Which brings me to my next point, which is Tier 2. So we're going to talk a little bit briefly about, I'm trying to remember how much time I have.
You're solid on time.
Okay, cool. So we're thinking about behavior and behavioral function at Tier 2 as well. So again, you're probably all familiar with talking about behavioral function at Tier 3. As Sarah said, we want to think about it across all functions, and I can't wait for Sarah to get back up here because I want her to talk about what we mean by how to address some of these things at Tier 1 as well. But in the meantime, you got to listen to me. So in thinking about Tier 2 and the purpose of Tier 2, of course, we know that targeted interventions are designed to increase structure within the environment, additional instruction related to those behavioral expectations and prompts, maybe some additional prompts for students at Tier 2, additional opportunities to practice and receive feedback on those expected behaviors. So that's something, of course, we're already doing at Tier 1. We're just kind of upping the ante a little bit, right? Like we're making sure that we're providing more of that. They need to be efficient. So when we're thinking about Tier 2 interventions, this need to be something that can be implemented with minimal teacher effort and, with taking minimal time away from instruction. They need to be available to any student at any time. Sorry. They need to be available to any student at any time, which of course means that all staff need to know what our Tier 2 interventions are and how to refer a student for Tier 2 intervention, how to implement pieces of that intervention if that's what's required in the classroom. But all of our staff already need to be trained on this so that when we identify that there's a student that needs Tier 2 support, within 3 days, right? Within 3 days, we need to be able to get that in place. They need to be in place, hopefully, to provide those students that are struggling with a bridge, if you will, before needing those really resource-intensive supports at Tier 3. Again, as mentioned, we know that those are resource-intensive supports, so we have to be efficient in the way that we use those. So in other words, we want only those students that truly need the most intensive support to be receiving that level of support. So if a student can be successful with less intensive support, we need to make that happen, just because there's never going to be enough expertise or enough resources in any school or any district to, for example, have 30% of your students on individualized plans. Not going to happen. It's just not going to happen. So we need to make sure that we have really strong Tier 1 and Tier 2 supports in place to prevent that from happening. We also want to think about function. We want to think about function, as Sarah was talking about, this sort of function-based thinking. So not necessarily that we need to do a full FBA, but we want to think about the function for this particular individual in terms of why this challenging behavior is continuing to occur or what skill deficit is there. So here are some reasons why we think functionally. First, of course, to improve the effectiveness of the interventions that we're selecting for Tier 2. And there is a good bit of research out there that shows that modifying interventions to address function at Tier 2 can be effective, more effective rather than just using sort of a standard intervention for everyone. We want to be student-centered. So again, coming back to this idea of what is the student communicating through their behavior and how can we still address those needs. And so understanding why the behavior is occurring helps us to do that. Also, we want to make sure that we never fall into the trap of thinking that additional supports are only for reducing challenging behavior. So the way that we reduce challenging behavior more often than not is to teach the skills that a student needs to be successful. So we're not just looking at behavioral reduction, we're looking at increasing the behaviors that we want to see more of instead. And then finally, there's no reason not to. So there are lots of efficient options out there that are already available, different ways that we can use quick and handy survey tools to think about function, do some brief observations, and then come back to that piece that Sarah was talking about earlier, which is when we want to hypothesize why we think the behavior is occurring. Also, we do this because the TFI tells us so. So, it's kind of interesting to me that sometimes we don't think about function at Tier 2, because when we're looking at the tools that we have to actually assess the fidelity of our implementation of multi-tiered systems of support, we actually are supposed to be looking at function at Tier 2. So when we look at, for example, the Targeted Interventions Reference Guide, which is part of the TFI, it is a guide for function-based support options. It actually provides us with this table to look at some different options for potential Tier 2 supports that could be in place. And then looking at them in terms of specifically what type of function does this meet? So we talk about access to attention, access to items or activities, how to avoid activities, avoid attention. So looking at these different types of functions and sort of matching specific interventions to those. So I'm going to go back and just show you that. See, you've got your sort of yes or almost like check boxes, right? Does it meet this particular function? So this is something that we're supposed to be considering already at Tier 2. And we do this we can do some surveys, or if this is a student in your classroom, you know the student best, perhaps, or you may need to talk to the student or their family, but you're getting an idea of why this could be continuing to occur. You've already done some of those brief observations because you see them every day, right? But sometimes we can even do a better job by being a little bit of a fly on the wall. So maybe asking one of our other staff members, if possible, if they can take over just during a particular time and have you kind of sit back and observe what's going on. And then we want to either select a function matched intervention or think about what we're already implementing in our school at Tier 2 and think about how we might modify those interventions to match function. And then, of course, we want to confirm the function using function-based thinking and data, of course, and progress monitoring. So thinking about how we are using our data to ensure that we're collecting enough information to have those sort of sensitive enough measures to understand whether or not we have, in fact, confirmed the function. So I'm not going to go through this form, but I just wanted to say that at basicfba.com, which I did not mention earlier, but I should have mentioned earlier. So basicfba.com is another place that you can go to find a lot of resources that are related to how you may think about that sort of hierarchy of Tier 3 supports. So that's another place that's great to go to. There you will also find what we call the ABC Tracker, which is a form that teachers can use in their classrooms to do a sort of a mini FBA, if you will. So identifying the routines in which behavior is most and least likely to occur, and then also actually doing some basic direct observation to sort of come up with that hypothesized function of behavior. So in selecting function-based interventions, we want to remember that our goal at Tier 2 is to increase opportunities for skill building, also for more practice of those behaviors throughout the day, so that those behaviors, of course, can access reinforcement, right? So we want to practice so that we have opportunities to provide feedback. That's the whole goal of this additional practice. And considering student motivation, of course, helps us to identify powerful reinforcers. So as we were talking about earlier with that dense schedule reinforcement, so when we think about that dense schedule, we want to make sure that we're using the most powerful reinforcers that we have for that particular student, and understanding student motivation helps us to do that. So let's look at, for example, if we have a student who is seeking connection with adults, like if that is why we're thinking that they're engaging in challenging behavior, then we might want to make sure that we're still thinking, even at Tier 2, about this sort of level of we want to prevent, we want to teach new skills, and we want to think about the consequences that we're providing. I want to be really clear, and I think you probably already know this, but when we use the term consequences, we are not talking about something bad, right? We're not referring to punishment. A lot of times when I hear the word consequences in school-based settings, people are talking about something negative. When we're talking about consequences, we're only talking about something that follows the behavior. So reinforcement is also a consequence in this case. But for example, when we're thinking about function for a student who has Tier 2 needs that is seeking adult attention, one of the things that we could do to prevent challenging behavior is actually to provide frequent non-contingent attention for that student. So, and by that I don't mean we're going to stop and hang out with the kid, stop instruction. Instead, things like praise, even proximity or eye contact, these also, can function as attention. So I'm just going to stand next to you and put my hand on your desk when I'm talking. That can be enough for some students. Or I'm going to give you a thumbs up real quick, while I'm in the middle of what I'm saying. So those can function as effective ways to prevent challenging behavior from occurring, essentially by preventing that deprivation of attention, if you will. And speaking of deprivation of attention, particularly when the student is going into a context that is challenging, where you're likely to see that type of challenging behavior, that would be a great time to actually stop long enough to give a little one-on-one, even if it's just for a minute, because again, you're decreasing that need in that case for attention, so they're less likely to engage in challenging behavior in that situation. We also want to teach the student to do something more appropriate to gain access to attention. So something like teaching the student to raise their hand and ask when they need help. And I also put on here, because it's an important next step, is that we need to teach tolerance for waiting, right? So we oftentimes will have a kiddo that's raising their hand constantly, which is okay right at first, and we can address that need, but eventually we also need to be teaching how to wait. So when you raise your hand and I give you the 1 second, and then I'm actually going to come back to you in 1 second, and then eventually over time we're going to increase that amount of time that you're able to tolerate waiting. We also, of course, want to make sure that when the student does raise their hand that we're actually acknowledging that. And this is just a soapbox, but if you're going to the trouble of teaching a new skill, one of the things that's hardest to see is when someone has just been taught, or a student has just been taught a new skill, and they use it, and it's not reinforced or it's not acknowledged, and it's like, they used it. You got to do something here. So make sure that if the student in this case is raising their hand, it's being acknowledged. Frequent teacher attention when completing work or on task. Of course, we also want to shift to the student being able to be independent, right? And then rewards should include activities with the teacher and other adults in the school if that's what they're seeking. So we're just thinking, again, functionally, why is this student engaging in interfering behavior, and how can I mitigate that, essentially? Okay, just a couple more. So when we're thinking about modifying standardized interventions, so how many of you are familiar, for example, with check-in, check-out? I see 97.6. Okay, so we're going to just move quickly through that. But when we think about modifying interventions, of course, it kind of works to our advantage when we already have a system set up in the school that we can just modify, because then staff are already knowledgeable about what this intervention is, and we can hopefully just make some small changes to that. So we think about the context, and then we think about, of course, the function, and those two together give us sort of these appropriate modifications. So since everyone in here raised your hand, I'm not going to go over what check-in, check-out is, but we are going to talk about some ways to modify check-in, check-out. And this is the typical check-in, check-out cycle where, in the morning, a student would check in with an adult. They would then receive some of those check-ins throughout the day with their teacher, afternoon check-out, and then, of course, that information goes home as well. So that's our sort of check-in, check-out cycle. And as you can see, even just by looking at this cycle, this is best for students who are seeking or who are highly reinforced by adult attention, right? They're receiving a lot more adult attention. They're getting a lot more opportunities for feedback from adults through this process. I believe Dr. Pinkney is going to be talking perhaps about some of this work in the afternoon. So just so you know, it's complete aside, but I feel like we're having like a little reunion today because Pinkelman and Pinkney and Stephanie, we all went to the University of Oregon, and it's like, woohoo! We all get to see each other. It's fabulous. So the student, of course, also receives this sort of daily progress report. So they're getting, in addition to that teacher feedback, they're getting a very salient way of seeing how they're doing throughout the day. So Klingbeil, I think I'm saying that right, maybe not, but Klingbeil et al. In 2019 published a paper where they were looking at 11 studies that have been published specifically focused on how to modify check-in, check-out and have positive effects with students. So the results of this study they were saying that it's not necessarily fully an evidence-based practice, but it is very much a promising practice to think about how we are using check-in, check-out in a different way. So they give some examples for modifications that we can make, for example, for escape maintain behavior. So in this case, this would be escape from academic demands. So things like, and I know this is tiny writing and I'm not going to read it all to you, but things like embedding prompts for break requests into check-in, check-out. So teaching routines around requesting breaks and teaching responses to teacher giving or in some cases denying breaks. So again, that kind of building up that wait time and that tolerance for waiting. And then earning free time after completing work as opposed to just earning more adult feedback. Linking daily goals and points earned to work completion. And then also thinking about reward choices that include options such as homework passes, maybe leave early from class breaks or break opportunities, all these types of things that would be meeting that need for escaping some of those tasks. However, I feel like I have to say this when we're talking about escape maintain behavior. Again, coming back to that dense schedule of reinforcement for actually being on task and completing those tasks and teaching the skills that the student needs to be able to successfully complete those tasks. And I say that because I have too many times been in situations where I've asked staff, can the student complete this task independently? Are they able to do that? Surprisingly, to see the teacher or hear the teacher say no. And if you're giving a student a task that they cannot complete independently, what would you have them do? You know, I mean, that's what I just come back to every time. It's like you're basically setting yourself and the student up for interfering behavior. So we want to make sure that when we're thinking about escape maintain behavior, that yes, we are providing some of these alternatives, such as asking for breaks or changing the task, but that we're also teaching that the skill that the student needs in order to be successful to contact that natural reinforcement. Sorry, I'm going to step down off the soapbox real quick. Okay. So now let's think about access to peer attention. So how we might modify check-in, check-out, thinking about access to peer attention. So some ways to prevent problem behavior potentially, scheduling peer interactions prior to challenging periods of the day for students. We're going to think about teaching peers to ignore distractions, and that's not to ignore this student, right? We want to teach this as part of our class-wide expectations. What do we do when a student's off task? What do we do when someone's trying to talk to us, who's talking to us about something completely unrelated, to what's going on in the class? We want to teach our students how to react so that we're not addressing this particular student in that way, but that we're just teaching everyone how we do that. We want to teach requests for peer work or peer tutoring from that student who's having a challenge. And invite a peer to daily check-in, check-outs if that's helpful. So this is something that I actually want to do some research around. So if anybody's interested, raise your hand. I want to do some more work around how are we including peers more in the check-in, check-out system, particularly for students that are older, for which peer attention becomes even more valuable as opposed to adult attention. But that's sort of an aside.
So there's a question in the chat that's directly related. Sorry, I'm over
Sorry.
here. The question, and I was going to wait, but the question was, would it be appropriate to have check-in, check-out, have a student at a lower grade check-in with an older student? Because they're running short on adults and people, and there's lots who would benefit from check-in, check-out.
I I think it depends is always the answer, right? I think there are certain situations under which that could be okay and appropriate. I don't have a great answer for that question. Pinkney, you're talking about this later, so I want you to think on that and provide a good answer. Yeah, that's a good point. So Sarah just said, we can try something out and collect data, but we also want, I guess one of the places my mind goes to though is that we don't want to sort of overburden that other student. So we want to be really careful in sort of the way that we include other students in this process. So building a seamless continuum of support. So coming back to this idea, and I'm about to transition off here, but coming back to this idea of having this seamless continuum in place, we want to make sure that our tier 2 goals, or when you think about that behavior report card, for example, for check in, check out, or if you're working on particular goals with a student who's requiring tier 2 supports, that they are explicitly linked back to tier 1. Right? They're explicitly linked back to our tier 1 expectations. And again, that is because hopefully that tier 2 support is going to work. And we're going to want to fade that support out systematically. And when we do that, we need that explicit linkage with tier 1 in order to be able to do that successfully. So I'm going to hand it back over to Sarah now.
Question back here. That's a great
Oh, yeah.
You keep saying we need to teach this. Who's we?
We need to teach new skills.
Yeah.
Teaching.
So, like, I'm a special ed teacher in a middle school, and we have 7 hours a day. Who's the we that teaches the skills?
So if you're talking about a replacement skill, for example, that's a really good question. So we want to select something that's already in the student's repertoire. So we want to select something that they're already able to do, but they're just not doing when we need them to do it. And then you need to teach that. And that doesn't mean that we're going to take, 45 minutes out of your instructional day to do that. We need to, again, coming back to this is something that's already in their repertoire, something that they should be able to learn really quickly. And so this could be something that we practice for a minute at the beginning of each, time block.
Right. So if if they have an IEP or a 504, we have someone in place in our school to teach those things. But if they don't, then we're at tier 1 or tier 2 here. Tier 2, I guess. Then is it their science teacher? Is it?
Yes.
Do I go and do that?
No. Yes. The answer is all of the above. Yeah.
Right?
So,
like, how do you decide who teaches that and when? Because then, you know what I'm getting at?
I think so. Yeah. So you're talking about middle school, so there are multiple teachers, right? Yeah. So when you got your tier 2 system in place, and I'm just going to go with tier 2 here. So like you said, with tier 3, we have an IEP usually, not always, but even if not, we at least have a behavioral support plan that lays this out, right? So I would say that on your card, right, like not your card, but your behavior report card that comes to you as a teacher, it's going to explicitly lay out what are those goals that the student is working on. So everyone in the school should have already learned about check in, check out and how to use this system. And,
So even if maybe they don't have check in, check out, and we're just trying to teach a skill. Like you're saying the teachers need to identify it, and then the teachers need to teach it in their classrooms.
yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you. And again, efficient, right? We're not talking about let's take a lot of time out of each instructional day, but yes, every teacher on that team should understand what that skill is that we're teaching, and everyone should be prompting that skill or occasioning that behavior. Yes.
Yeah, and just to follow up with that question, like I think what you're hinting on, what Kathleen was talking about, is really like the implementation challenges that happen when we try to take these research-validated practices and put them within noisy, challenging, resource-stripped environments like schools. And don't get me wrong, I've dedicated my career to working in schools because I'm so passionate about that, like, Kathleen here too. But I would encourage, if you're feeling like you are in a situation where there isn't clarity for who is responsible for what, that's something that I would take to your school team and have a very explicit conversation about, well, what does our implementation plan look like? Who is going to be responsible for teaching? Who is going to be responsible for this? And really work together as a team. And I know getting all the team together is really hard sometimes, but just trying to think about, like, given the constraints that we have here in our school, how could we make this look? How could we make this work for our student? And there's no magic bullet. I'm really sorry. If there was a magic bullet, I'm not sure most of us in this room would have jobs because we'd be coasting and things would be going great. All right. Let's move into talking about Tier 1 then. So a quick assumption here, this is something that we've been talking about. Behavior is functionally related to that teaching environment. So when we're thinking about Tier 1, there are Tier 1 research-validated practices that, when in place, are functionally related to students doing better in those contexts. So behavior is improving, they're learning, et cetera. And that's not just to say they're in place, but they're also in place and they're being implemented with consistency and fidelity. All right, so I'm going to ask you all a question, and I'm just going to ask you to shout out, and that I'll repeat what you shout out into the mic so the online folks can hear. So what are some of those Tier 1 practices that we kind of harp that should be implemented consistently with fidelity? So 3 to 5 positively stated school-wide expectations. That's one. What's another one? Anybody? Acknowledgement, yeah. So reinforcing and praising behavior when we see it. What else?
Opportunities to respond.
Yeah, I love that one. High opportunities to respond. What else? We'll do 2 more. Yeah, continuum of consequences. So what we're doing when behavior happens. 1 more.
Database decision-making.
Right on. Great, thanks. So you just hit on not all of them, but some of them that are included within this paper. So this is a paper written by Brandy Simonson et al., 2008. They outline a variety of research-validated practices as Tier 1. So we talk about things like maximizing structure. So we're going to have a schedule. We're going to have routines. We're going to teach a student that schedule. We're going to teach them routines within that schedule. We're going to have those very clear expectations for behavior, those 3 to 5 positively stated school-wide rules. We're going to teach those expectations and rules across all the different contexts within the school. So what does it look like in science? What does it look like in the lunchroom? What does it look like while you're waiting for the bus, right? And we're going to prompt and reinforce those as they happen. We're going to monitor student behavior by moving around, scanning, interacting with our students to be close if we need to redirect or reinforce as needed. We also already mentioned reinforcement and responding to those errors. Thanks for y'all in the audience. And then engaging instruction. So one of your colleagues mentioned high opportunities to respond. We're going to be thinking about embedding choice. So how can students maybe have the choice between different activities? Sequencing activities differently, which we'll talk a little bit about in a few slides, and also looking at task difficulty, getting back to what Kathleen was saying. If we're asking students to do some independent work, is it something that they can do independently? Because if you're given a task that you can't do independently, I don't know about y'all, but I'll probably engage in some type of behavior that's not going to be doing the work. I'm going to get on my phone, I'm going to walk out, I'm going to do something else, right? Okay. So these research-validated tier practices, as I mentioned, is in this Simonson et al. 2008 paper. One of our colleagues and co-authors on the paper that we're working on, Kelsey Morris, and some of his colleagues in 2019 put these together in what they call the Great 8. So there was a PDF that was emailed to you, so you can go ahead and get that out while I'm talking, that's about the Great 8. So they took these research-validated practices that we just talked about over here, put them neatly within this Great 8 kind of fancy little hook line about what these Tier 1 practices would look like. And then what's really cool is that they then overlaid function across those. So we have Tier 1, which is awesome, and that has gotten us so far and will continue to get us very far. But then we're thinking about, well, what would happen if we brought function into the mix here? And how could that increase the efficacy of those Tier 1 practices? So if you go ahead and look at that PDF, it looks something like this. So it's going to be really hard to see on the screen here, but you have access to that. So you see each of the Great 8. So you see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. In the black text is just what the Great 8 would be, regular Tier 1. And then the colored text matches on to different functions that you might hypothesize. So purple would be if you're thinking that students might be engaging in behavior to gain connection or attention. The blue is for students that you think might be trying to avoid that attention from others. And then the green would be for students where you hypothesize that they might be engaging in that behavior to avoid a particular task. So it's a really great document that just provides an outline of what Tier 1 practices look like, and then what if we overlay function, how could you even increase the efficacy of those Tier 1 practices? So we'll do a couple examples here. So one, for active supervision. We already mentioned how it's important to actively supervise our students. If you see a single student or a group of students that is engaging in behavior to gain attention, one thing you might do is just schedule more frequent interactions. So we're going to supervise, but for this group of students over here, or for that particular student, we're going to come over a little bit more frequently within that active supervision because we know that some interfering behavior is likely to happen in order to get that connection or in order to get that attention. If we flip it and we're looking at for a group of students or an individual student who is engaging in interfering behavior to avoid attention, with our active supervision, we still need to supervise, right? So we still need to be around. We can't just completely leave the room and give that student, remove our attention. But what we can do is think about things like more proximity control. So rather than coming right up to like Kathleen and checking in to see how she's doing and like providing any reinforcement or redirection, we could just do some proximity control. So I could get within 6 feet and just kind of take a look and then go on my merry way. So just thinking a little bit more functionally about what those Tier 1 practices are and then how we could overlay function on there. We're going to do some examples, so I'm going to go ahead and skip these, and we're going to do 3 different examples. I'm going to ask for some opportunities to respond, so you're going to have to get ready. So this first one, we're going to do together. So this is going to be an I do, a Sarah do. The next one is going to be a we do. So I'm going to ask for you to give me some information about how we could overlay function to maximize efficacy. And then the third one we're going to do is going to be a full-on opportunity for you to come up with an idea on your own. So 3 opportunities, just so you get ready and kind of focus in here. Let's think about our standard Tier 1 practice here. So let's say we have a routine where there's independent work happening in algebra. So we did our large group instruction, and now we're transitioning to students to do independent work on the content area that we just covered in algebra. The antecedent to the group's behavior is the teacher provides the instruction to complete that independent algebra worksheet, so to speak. One student might say, making comments like, this is lame, and then other students are like, yeah, this is really lame. Why do we have to do this, right? You can see this situation happening, right, at a Tier 1 level. The teacher then would tell as a consequence students to get to work. And the result, students do not get to work and continue laughing, making comments, and like that noise level increases, right? So we see this situation from our typical standard Tier 1 lens. A recommendation that I might make would be, well, just remind students before the expectations for independent work. So we're going to pre-correct. So before giving them independent work, we're going to remind them, all right, remember, we're going to be doing our independent algebra right now. When we do our independent algebra work, you're going to do your work, and when you're done, you're going to raise your hand, and I'll come over and get your work, and you're going to do another independent task. So we're going to pre-correct before. Seems like a pretty good strategy, right? Now let's overlay function and see how that might change. So function-based thinking at Tier 1, nothing has changed here. So we still have the same context where they're given the independent work, they're saying it's lame, they're not doing it, and things are getting a little out of control here. If we put on our function thinking cap, we might think, well, it seems like they're wanting to get out of this task, which is not that far off, right? It's algebra. I mean, I don't know about y'all, but that was not my favorite subject in school either. So they might be engaging in that behavior to get out of algebra in this particular moment. Our Tier 1 recommendation could change now that we have that function-based thinking and that function lens. We might then think about, well, maybe I could intersperse some difficult with easy independent work tasks. So they're trying to get out of this task because maybe it's too hard, maybe it's too long, whatever it is. So maybe I could make that task less aversive. So I could start out with some easier things before they get into the harder ones. I could maybe shorten independent work tasks. So rather than doing 50 equations, they only have to do 20 or whatever that looks like. Algebra teachers, please correct me. We could provide more practice before doing independent work. If, like what Kathleen was saying, if we're thinking that the independent work is way too hard, they just might need more practice before they're asked to do it independently. So the recommendation at Tier 1 can change if you're laying that function over it, if you're doing that function-based thinking. Okay. So, and that isn't to say that we're going to totally throw the regular or standard Tier 1 strategy out the window. What we're saying is you might do a combination of these two things, and that might increase the efficacy of your Tier 1 recommendation. All right, so this next one, y'all are going to provide the function-based Tier 1 strategy, okay? So here's a different situation. Let's say elementary context, the routine is lining up following large group instruction. So we just got done with large group instruction. We're having students line up the door to transition somewhere out of the classroom. The antecedent teacher tells the students to line up with voice at a 0. Behavior, all the students are talking loudly with one another, joking around, not lining up with voices at a 0. Teacher tells them to quiet down to a 0. They do not quiet down to a 0. They continue talking loudly. So a typical Tier 1 strategy might be reteach the expectations for lining up. And I've provided that recommendation, and it's a good one. Well, maybe they don't remember, maybe we need to pre-correct or reteach what we mean by lining up with voice at a 0, because maybe they forgot what that looks like. Pretty good recommendation. Now, let's put on our function-based thinking lens. Let's say that we're hypothesizing that they're engaging in this to get attention, which seems possible because we just finished large group instruction where they probably weren't hanging out with their friends. Now we're transitioning somewhere and they're close to their friends and they're talking and they're continuing to talk. And so the consequence is continuing to talk. So we're going to think it might be connection with peers could be a function to that interfering behavior here. So this is where I'm going to ask you to think about it for like 30 seconds, and then I would like someone to shout out what might be a recommendation that we would make for Tier 1 if we are thinking about function. This group of students clearly want to hang out and talk with their friends. What is something that we could do at that Tier 1 level to decrease all the interfering behavior that's happening? Go ahead and talk in your groups, 30 seconds, and then we'll come back. I'm pretty sure. Probably skip to get practice. I don't think we'll have time to. All right, go ahead and finish up your brilliant ideas. Y'all are very easily redirected, brought back. Thank you. Okay, I would love to hear from a couple of groups. What is something that you thought would be a good idea that incorporates function into this Tier 1 scenario?
I can kick this off, Sarah. The online group said perhaps add in 2 minutes to talk before lining up.
I love it. That's exactly what I thought. Yeah, so before you get them to transition, giving them a couple of minutes to hang out and talk with one another. Because you're not going to take away the fact that they want to hang out with their friends right now. But what you can do is provide an appropriate opportunity for them to hang out with their friends before you then transition to lining up. Yeah, thank you.
We talked about incorporating a task in your transition to eliminate peer conversations, so like giving them something to do as they're moving to the next thing.
Okay, great. So for the online folks, they were saying here is they were incorporating some task that the students could do while lining up. And if we overlay function with that, it could be a task that they get to do with a friend. Yep. So it could be that, all right, work with Kathleen, because she's my favorite, work with Kathleen to go pick up the markers and go put them over, and then you get to transition with your buddy to go line up. Love it. Both of those incorporate, including the function, which is they want to hang out with their friends, into the Tier 1 situation that we got rolling here. Really great, you all. Any questions? Okay, so we were going to do a your turn here, but with time, we only have about 7 minutes left, and I want to leave an opportunity for some questions. So I'll just go ahead and finish these last couple slides and see if people have questions. And if you don't have questions, then we can always come back to that activity if you want, or you can get out early, I suppose, too. That'll be a test of how engaging Kathleen and I have been. All right. So one thing that I've been thinking about at Tier 1, and the thing that caused me a little bit of pause, I was like, well, hey, Sarah, put a pump on the brakes. Because you're not doing an FBA, how do you know if you got the right function or not? And that's a legit question. However, I would argue you're not going to be able to do an FBA for all the students in your class. So we can think and we can try something, collect data. If it's not working, we didn't get the function right. So if we tried both of those ideas of giving 2 minutes before transitioning and transitioning with a partner, and students are still talking loudly and joking around, then I might think of something different, because that clearly wasn't working. So this is why we do data, 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 data. We're going to collect data and make decisions based on those data. If behavior is improving, then you likely had the correct function. Way to go, right on. Plow forward. If you didn't, we try something different. Back to the functional skills. So this is at the end of the presentation because it didn't really feel like it flowed anywhere, not because it's not important. In fact, I think this is one of the most important things that we can think about at Tier 1. So as I mentioned before, early on, the functional skills are the skills that we all need to navigate life. So these are the things like asking for things that you want, being able to get rid of things that you don't like, etc. These skills relate to some of those primary functions of interfering behavior that we often happen in our classrooms. And those interfering behaviors develop because of skill deficits, because students don't have the functional skills to get their needs met. And so I would encourage you all that if you have a student at Tier 1 who you're seeing does not have some of those basic skills, that rather than waiting for interfering behavior to develop, because it's gonna, if you don't have the skills to get your needs met, you're gonna get your needs met some other way. Teach those skills from the start. So there's this paper that was written in 2019 by Shala Alai and colleagues, and this paper is primarily geared toward an early childhood audience, but the messages in here ring true across the lifespan, even into adulthood. That these are like the 4 skills that we all need in order to be successful in life. So I recommend you take a look. You'll have these slides, and so you'll have all of these up here, but it's pretty much the skills that I talked about. Communicating wants, needs, dislikes, gaining attention and affection of others, engaging in activities alone, coping with and tolerating adversity and delay to things, learning how to wait. All of these are skills that we need to learn. They relate to those primary goals of positive behavior support, which is the primary goal is to improve that quality of life, and the secondary goal is to see a reduction in some of the behavior that interferes with learning. And so teaching, even if we're not seeing any interfering behavior happening yet, that still aligns with a positive behavior support framework and still something that we should be doing. So in summary, and then we'll move to questions, we really should be considering function across all those tiers of support, because behavior that interferes with learning occurs everywhere, not just at Tier 2 or Tier 3. Function-matched interventions or function-based thinking can increase the effectiveness at Tier 1 and Tier 2. And also something we didn't talk too much about, but it's another really important point, that students who are receiving Tier 3 supports, if they're in an environment, like a Tier 1 type environment that is incorporating function, that student is going to be much more successful in that environment, because they're having similar continuity of supports and function-matched environments within those contexts too. So it's great for our Tier 3 students to help them participate in more of those least restrictive environments. And then lastly, all students need to learn those functional skills that I just went over. So with that, we'll open up for questions. We have 2 minutes. And I should mention too, I see you, Melissa, that Kathleen and I are available, send us an email. I'm also at Western Michigan now, so this is my first year here in Michigan, so send me an email. I'd love to connect with any of you all. Partnering with schools is something that I love doing and why I'm here in Michigan, so reach out, please.
So one of the questions online was, one of the biggest struggles is getting teachers to buy into adopting function-based thinking, function-based interventions. Some of them feel like this isn't their job. Do you have any ideas how to encourage them for buy-in?
Wow, how long do we have? Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I wish that there was, again, like the magic bullet that would work for that. But for me, what has worked for me in the past, I guess I can speak from personal experience, is helping teachers see that, well, what you're doing isn't working, and so let's try something different. And really helping them like understand like what function is. Because I also think there's a lot of misrules and misconceptions about function out there. And so all of us in this room, we can plow forward in supporting people to understand that function isn't necessarily something bad. It's not something reserved for Tier 3. It's something that we should be considering across all of those different tiers of support. I see Kathleen approaching, so we'll let her.
Speaking of sort of using data, I think that this isn't always a possibility because there's not always someone that can come in and do this. When I worked in schools, I was a behavior specialist. And, you know, one of the things that I would do too is I would go into classrooms and I would actually collect data on the amount of time that students were teaching addressing challenging behavior. That we're using addressing challenging behavior. So how much time are you spending addressing challenging behavior in your classroom? And then if we can put something in place and I can show you that you're actually spending a tiny bit of time trying to do some preventative stuff and it's saving you this much time on the back end, that helps to get a little bit of buy-in as well. So I don't know if you have folks in your district who do things like that, but that can be super helpful too.
Yeah, and one thing, Kathleen, what you were saying that kind of, was there another question?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I did that in my former position, and this was pre-COVID, and they were saying, our educators were saying that they were spending 50 to 75% of their instructional time addressing behaviors in the classroom and implementing some strategies to reduce that, bringing them in at the end of the year. It didn't get them to 100%, but it got them much closer.
Yeah.
So I would agree, being able to document and observe and collect that data is so important, and knowing that, I think the buy-in piece is there's that front-loaded time that needs to be dedicated towards the instruction, and knowing that in the end, you're gonna recoup some of that time moving forward.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've used the situation of like students needing breaks in the past, where the student is going to take a break regardless.
Yeah.
So they're going to take a break engaging in this interfering behavior, or they can take a break by asking for one and having permission to do that. And so it's going to happen. And so it's getting and thinking about how we can kind of better do that within the context of the classroom.
The last thing that I would add with that too is that when it's particularly related to Tier 3 supports, when we're developing Tier 3 supports, we need to be including implementers when we're doing that, so that we're not walking into a classroom and saying, here's your plan, this is what you're doing, but instead we're meeting together and saying, here's what I'm thinking, how does this work in your classroom? And if this isn't going to work under these conditions, help me understand how we might change this or modify this slightly so that it could. But yeah, I don't think that, you know, we all know that if I walk in and hand you a plan to do, you're going to put that plan in a drawer, and then when I come back next time, you're going to be like, where's that plan again? Right? So including those that are going to be implementing the plan, and not just because we're trying to get buy-in, but because we need that information when we're building plans. Yeah.
Thanks, everybody. Reach out, send us an email if you have any questions.